Welcome to the Untold Story podcast. I'm Martha McCallum, and we're getting close to the 80th anniversary of D-Day, and we'll be doing live coverage from there. And I can't think of a better person to speak with as we get ready for that journey than Garrett Graff, who is the author of many remarkable history books, and he's a Pulitzer Prize finalist. And his new book is called When the Sea Came Alive, An Oral History of D-Day. So, Garrett, welcome. It's great to have you with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for marking this important anniversary.
It certainly is. And, I never get tired of revisiting this day. And in the intro to your book, you write about the fact that although there are many D-Days, for most of us and most of those in history, there's really only one, right?
Yeah, I mean, D-Day is, as you know, a very straightforward and ubiquitous military term that just means the start of any operation, since for large, complex operations, the planning starts long before a date or time or even location is necessarily selected. But, if you say D-Day to anyone on the street, there is only one D-Day that people think of, and it is June 6th, 1944.
You talk about all the writing that has been done on this topic, and wonderful films, The Longest Day and Saving Private Ryan, and all of these great documents. So as a historian who has tackled September 11th with The Only Plane in the Sky and many other great historic moments, what made you decide that this is the book you wanted to write now?
As you mentioned, I had done a previous oral history of 9/11 that was called The Only Plane in the Sky, that came out in 2019. And 2019 was a unique moment for 9/11 memories because it was the 18 years thereafter the first American servicemen and women were being deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan who were born after 9/11 itself. And it was right at this hinge moment where 9/11 was beginning to change from memory into history. The 80th anniversary for D-Day feels to me like the opposite end of that moment. There were certainly plenty of 17, 18, 19-year-olds involved in the D-Day operation, but even them are close to 100 now. And that this is a moment where this generation that was, a million combatants involved on D-Day itself across the British Isles and Europe is down to maybe just a few thousand remaining. And that this is a moment where D-Day and World War II writ large is fully slipping from memory into history. And so I wanted to take this moment when we effectively have every memory that we are going to have of D-Day, effectively every story of D-Day that was recorded in the first person now exists, and to try to go back and weave together the story of that day in the voices of the participants themselves to a generation who no longer remember D-Day at all.
Yeah. Just as a side note, I just did a documentary, two-part documentary called The Final Journey, because I was speaking to one of a veteran who became a friend, Tom Rice, who jumped in the 101st Airborne, and his nephew wrote to me and he said, the next time you talk to Tom, I just want you to realize that he's on his final journey on this earth. And as so many of these men are, and I think you're so right, because the 40th anniversary of D-Day was sort of a window where the first veterans were going back. Yep. And Reagan gave that wonderful speech that was written by Peggy Noonan. And this feels like the bookend to that. It feels like the other end of that, where the last of these men will be able to go, just a few of them. They're all, 96, 97, 100 plus, some of them. Yep. You say that you felt that there were, stories that weren't told about D-Day in many ways. And I want to ask you about that. But actually, before I get to that, I want to ask you this. The reason for doing this as an oral history rather than a book, than a straightforward book.
Yeah.
Why did you decide to do that, Garrett?
So for these giant mass historical moments, 9/11, the most famous day, certainly the most consequential day of the 21st century, D-Day, arguably the single most famous, most consequential day of the 20th century. I think that there's a tendency in narrative history to write the story sort of more cleanly and neatly than those days were actually experienced by the people who lived through them. We write D-Day so triumphantly now as history, this incredible moment of bravery and courage and heroism as the Allies stormed ashore. You get back into the first person memories of the people, and what you see is, you're experiencing the day with no more information than they had themselves in that moment. And the men in the ships off the Normandy coast that morning, you listen to them and they weren't feeling particularly heroic. They weren't feeling particularly courageous. They didn't know that this day was going to be a triumph of history. They didn't know it was going to be successful. They didn't know what the next couple of hours would bring. And to try to recapture, I think, that fear and uncertainty and the confusion of that day, by the way, both on the Allied side and the German side. The title of the book, When the Sea Came Alive, is from a quotation from one of the German defenders of Omaha Beach, who, wakes up that morning, looks out the slit of his bunker and is like, oh, wait, the sea is now filled with ships, and this seems like this is actually going to be a pretty bad day for me. Because, they were as surprised as anyone.
Oh, I thought it was, I didn't know this. You mentioned that there were more people killed in the training and preparation for D-Day than on D-Day itself. Tell us more about that.
Yeah. One of the things I was not expecting when I started writing this book was to spend as much time as I did on the training and preparation for D-Day. About the first third of the book is the planning of D-Day, the logistics, the buildup in the UK of American troops and material. And this sort of stunning statistic, which a historian named Peter Caddick-Adams has calculated in recent years, that actually more Americans and more Allied troops were killed in the training for D-Day in 1943 and 1944 than on D-Day itself. And I tell the story now relatively well known, but then quite secret in the book of what was known as Exercise Tiger, which was the final large-scale exercise in the United Kingdom for the units that were going to head to Utah Beach. And British, they're sort of storming ashore in this evacuated part of the British countryside. And on the night, as they are preparing offshore for their mock invasion, German torpedo boats get through the security screen and sink some of the landing craft and end up killing somewhere north of 700 servicemen. We don't actually know the final number, and the Pentagon, covered it up literally for decades that this happened at all. But for those units headed to Utah Beach, Exercise Tiger killed multiples of the casualties that they actually suffered during the invasion itself.
That's extraordinary. And they covered it up for what purpose?
This was just a couple of weeks before the D-Day invasion, and they were terrified about what it would do to morale. Here is, almost 1,000, perhaps over 1,000. Again, we don't know the final number of servicemen, killed in what are supposed to be friendly waters off the British coast. What message does that send about how the invasion is actually going to fare in the weeks ahead? And so, there was both concern about the public morale, but also the morale of the servicemen doing the invasion. It was Exercise Tiger, the debacle of it was covered up even within the services.
You talk about the leadership at the top, and then you spend the latter part of the book talking about leaders who emerged on the battlefield, and many who were, whose heroic moments are unknown or known only to the people around them. When you were compiling this really wonderful way to put together this story with all the voices of these people, what stood out to you in terms of the leaders and the generals? Was there anyone who sort of surprised you, or you became, more sort of drawn to in that process?
Yeah, I'm so happy that you asked about this, because this was to me such a fascinating sort of study in leadership for me. Sort of like you, I spend so much of my time in the political realm, thinking about political leadership and, successful leaders in American society. And the first third of this book, where you're talking about the training and the exercises and the logistics and the planning, that's all FDR and Eisenhower and Bernard Montgomery and Churchill. And then you get to D-Day itself, and, as of 6 a.m. on June 6th, 1944, there's not a single thing left that, any general can really do to influence the arc of D-Day. And it's entirely the story of leadership at really the lowest levels of the American military. And you see this moment where these, corporals and sergeants and lieutenants, 21 years old, 22 years old, are the reason for the success on the beaches, on the American beaches, the British beaches, the Canadian beaches, where, you have these low-level non-commissioned officers, low-level unit commanders, who are the ones who rally forward their, shattered comrades and traumatized comrades, wounded comrades, and, organize the effort to take this one machine gun nest here, this one, artillery battery there, and really win the day. And that, by contrast, what you actually also see is how calcified the German system and the German resistance actually was that morning, where they did not have anywhere near the dynamic training and leadership capabilities that were on display for the Allied troops that morning. And sort of, if the Germans had been a little bit more innovative and a little bit more able to seize the moment that morning in the way that the American troops do at Omaha Beach, for instance, these landings might have turned out very differently.
I'm curious why you think that is. And you talk about this sort of extraordinary confluence of leadership at the top, this sort of very unique combination of individuals who pulled this off. And we weren't extraordinarily well resourced, or we didn't have, extraordinary numbers of young men ready to go before Pearl Harbor. So how did we get from sort of a stance where nobody wanted to go to war again in this country to being ready for this kind of moment? And was that just sort of a, magic in a bottle kind of combination of people?
Yeah, I think to some extent it is. I mean, it is this incredible group of leaders, Eisenhower and FDR and Churchill and Montgomery on the British side. But it is also this amazing story of American industrial might, which the logistics of what it took to build the invasion force for D-Day is really incredible, especially when you remember we are also prosecuting an entire war in the Pacific at the same time against the Japanese. And, the army is building up for the invasion of Europe, fighting in North Africa, fighting in Italy, as the Marines are sort of marching up through the islands in the Pacific. And that there's sort of these moments that I really love when the Americans begin to sit down with the British to plan the invasion, and the Americans begin to sort of throw out these numbers of, how many troops will plan on landing, each month in 1943 in England, how many Jeeps will deliver, how many aircraft. And the British just can't believe it, because it's, like every month we are depositing in England, the equivalent of like all of the Jeeps that England has available at that moment. Like every month we are depositing, new aircraft the size of like the entire RAF, in 1941, 42. And the British just sort of keep having these moments where they're like, we're sitting in this meeting and the Americans are throwing out these numbers and we can't possibly imagine that they're true. And then actually it turns out that the Americans end up delivering, 2x, 3x of even these incredible numbers that they're throwing out in these planning meetings.
Extraordinary. The Untold Story continues right after this. In terms of the voices of these sort of, I wrote a book called Unknown Valor, which is about Iwo Jima. And, these heroic stories of these young men who leaned on each other and whose heroism, as I mentioned before, are really only known to each other. What stands out to you when you think of those people? Any individuals that really, really struck you or stuck with you?
Yeah, there are a couple. And some of their stories are well known. The paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne, 101st Airborne. One of the threads through this book is following some of the members of Lieutenant Richard Dick Winter's Easy Company of the 506th, which is the unit memorialized in Band of Brothers. But then there are also these incredible stories that we do not know and that we have not remembered. One of the people that I follow and try to give a lot of attention to in the book is Staff Sergeant Waverly Woodson, who was a black medic from the only black combat unit to land on D-Day at Omaha Beach. He's wounded even before he makes it to shore, and he is then he's one of the only medics on Omaha Beach, and ends up treating something like 200 casualties on Omaha Beach, which is, depending on how exactly you count, between 5 and 7% of all of the U.S. casualties on Omaha Beach. I mean, this one guy,
and he was wounded himself.
He was wounded himself, and and is bleeding through this whole operation, and spends 30 hours on Omaha Beach treating the wounded before he's actually evacuated himself on June 7th. And he is nominated for the Medal of Honor, and in the racism of that moment in the segregated military, receives only the Bronze Star, which, as you know, is sort of its own meaningful recognition, but 4 levels below the Medal of Honor, and has sort of never been adequately recognized for his heroism on Omaha Beach that day.
It's obviously 80 years later, this is seen as this amazingly heroic moment in history that Americans and the French and Western Europeans remember very nostalgically. But it could have gone horribly wrong. It could have failed. What did you learn about that, and what do we all need to remember about that?
Yeah, and I think that this was part of what was so interesting about diving back into the mythology and lore of that day and that moment is the truth of the matter was D-Day itself was never actually going to fail. The Allies had built sort of such scale and scope and size, such overwhelming resources into that day. The truth of the matter is, there's not a single amphibious invasion in World War II that actually fails for the Allies. That, when they decided to do an invasion, they did it at such scale with such overcommitment of resources that they all succeeded. Where it's tenuous is in that, first 24, 48, 72 hours ashore. And that's where you see the German military really fall apart, which is if the Germans had responded more quickly to the D-Day invasion, if they had moved with more alacrity and finesse in organizing and bringing forward, their more elite panzer units, there's a real question of whether they could have, thrown the Allies back into the sea at Omaha Beach, potentially at Juno and Sword. There's a German counterattack that fails actually late on the day of June 6th that targeted the British and Canadian sectors, but that had it succeeded, might have really devastated some of those beach landings.
In terms of looking at it in retrospect and this greatest generation that we talk so much about, and when people dig in and read the quotes of these individuals, you're just constantly reminded of their incredible heroism, how young they were, how unsophisticated most of them were. Many of them had only trained for a few weeks to jump out of airplanes, and just their ability to be so dedicated to winning this war and to securing the freedom that Eisenhower talks about in your book about, we didn't go there to occupy, we went there to free people. What kind of reflections do you have on where we are? It feels like we're in such a sort of downer time in this country at this point in many ways. What do you take away from those comparisons and these young people?
I think that this is, that's to me an important part of recognizing this anniversary and sort of reflecting on its relevance to this moment. You've spent a lot of time with American servicemen and women in your work, and you know what an amazing fighting force they still are today. But as I talk about in the book, and as I quote people, this invasion is among the most noble causes that humans have ever fought in the history of humanity. And that's, I think, part of what makes D-Day so special and so important to remember and reflect upon, because it is this moment where we summon all of the best values of our democracy and our commitment to freedom across the world to launch a continental invasion, not to colonize, not to conquer, but to liberate, and to throw back the dark shadow of Nazi authoritarianism and totalitarianism across an entire continent. And the heroism and courage that it took for those participants, but also to your point, the national commitment to those values that it took as a society and as, our leaders in that moment to rally the country toward that goal, I think is a model that is, worth us thinking more about in this year, when we're going to spend so much of this year in our day-to-day life talking about sort of what America is and what it isn't.
Yeah. In working with these veterans, with our team here, you just walk out of these interviews and you're just constantly struck by the question, would teenagers today fake their birth certificates in order to go across the ocean and risk their lives and write letters to their sweethearts that they might not be coming back? I interviewed this one man, said he sent his girlfriend a letter saying, look, if you've had another boyfriend now, it's okay, because I'm probably not coming home.
Yeah.
It makes me wistful when I think about that attitude and that heroism. And I just wonder if we ever get it back, or does it take just like a huge threat to the country overall, which no one wants, to create that kind of American, fervor and commitment.
Yeah. And again, I think, in some ways, even though this is an event 80 years ago, the message that it has for America in an election year is just so important for us to remember as a country about what we stand for and what we believe in.
Yeah. Well, we'll be hearing from the president at Pointe du Hoc and during the ceremony the day before. And I would urge people to look at the Reagan speech there. It's a really stunning speech. And there were a lot of young men who were older then, who were there listening to it. It's pretty stirring. I was just reading that Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, invited a top Russian representative to attend this year. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, because obviously the U.S. and the allies included Russia at that time. What do you think about that decision? There's been some pushback from. Yeah,
I mean, it's leaders. A tough. It's tough to balance then and now, right? Which is, Russia was such an important ally in that moment. I think many Americans don't understand the incredible cost Russia bore during World War II. I mean, the 20 million dead.
More than any other country.
By, huge leaps and bounds. Yeah.
Yes.
And, I guess for whatever small, token it represents, I guess I could see an argument for including a Russian representative, if only to hearken back to a moment where, Russia was more committed to helping Europe than hurting Europe.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah.
Garrett, thank you so much. This is a really wonderful book, and I encourage everybody to buy it. It's just a wonderful deep dive into an extraordinarily important day in our history that we all need to have an understanding of in order to understand the times that we live in. It's called When the Sea Came Alive, an oral history of D-Day by Garrett Graff. Garrett, congratulations. Are you going to do an audio version of this?
Yes, they did actually a really amazing audio version of it. I would encourage people, particularly if you're a podcast listener, to get the audio version. Just dozens and dozens of voices, each voice individual. And you get the real sense of the scope of the nationalities and ethnicities in this. The British, the Canadian, the German, the French, the lots of incredible accents on that audiobook.
Well, I look forward to that. I tried to download it last night, but it hadn't dropped yet. So I guess the book comes out in 2 weeks. Is that right?
Yeah, June 4th. Yep.
June 4th, right before D-Day on the 6th. Okay. Garrett, thank you so much. Really a pleasure to talk to you. And
good luck with your trip.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Garrett.
All right. Bye-bye.
That is the Untold Story for today. I'm Martha McCallum. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to The Untold Story with Martha McCallum. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Make sure to rate and review. For more podcasts, go to foxnewspodcast.com. Listen ad-free with the Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.